Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. The website is foreigncountries.podbean.com. If you're enjoying Foreign Countries and you think it's worth $2 a month just to keep it going, please become a patron of the show. Go to patron.podbean.com/foreign countries. I've been looking into some really fascinating research on tomb disturbance and tomb violation, especially in Roman Italy. Now, I first thought that this was going to be about grave robbing, but it's not that. Or it's not that simple anyway. This is about the living and their ongoing relationships with the dead. In many cases, artefacts and ornaments were deliberately robbed or stripped from the tombs. The items removed are sometimes called spolia, and they were being recycled and reused by the living in a number of different ways. Often it was highly organised and in some cases officially sanctioned. But in addition to that, human intervention into tombs was quite commonplace. Secondary burials and communing with the dead were part of normal social life. Later on, I'll be talking to Dr. Liana Brent of Kenyon College about how the living interacted with the dead in Roman society. But joining me first is Dr. Cristina Murer of the University of Bern. Cristina's fascinating work is about tomb plundering, some of it legal and some of it not. Cristina, we know that tombs were being spoliated of their ornaments throughout the imperial period. Do we have historical documents describing this plundering?
So what is the evidence on the tomb spoliation? So next to the archaeology, it's overall the legal sources we have from the later Roman Empire. These are edicts promulgated by the late antique emperors overall in the 4th century, which forbade what had become a very frequent plundering and private plundering of tomb material. These edicts were promulgated by emperors and forbade this frequent habit. So one could argue that because it was forbidden, they didn't do it. But actually, when something is forbidden, that means it must have occurred. And because this law becomes so frequent in the 4th century, especially Constantius II has several laws against tomb plundering, we can argue that this must have occurred more frequently than in previous periods. And the second thing why this legal sources is so important for my research is that they're very detailed, informing us what was stolen from tombs. So they took ornamenta in stone and where they relocated the material. Some laws even say they took the ornamenta from tomb to adorn their dining halls or triclinia. So you can really look at these legal sources as the basis of proving how frequent this habit must have become.
So what were the legal edicts actually trying to prevent?
The edicts by the emperors, it's about 9 edicts in different parts of the Roman Empire, which were all promulgated in the 4th century, some of them in the early 5th century, which forbade the plundering of tombs. So they always refer to earlier existing law, so that's the tradition in Roman law, but they sometimes give new information. For example, also later laws also refer to the question of relicts. So they forbid the trafficking in these materials from the tombs and the trafficking with the relics in martyrs.
So do the edicts specifically outlaw plundering?
We have to see these edicts in context of other laws against plundering of buildings. So there are also edicts saying it's not allowed to destroy old monuments in a city, like bath monuments or general ornaments from the city. So these laws against tomb plundering or stealing material from tombs have to be read in these building laws by the emperors in the late Roman Empire. And they're not really referring to what the plundering means, or they don't mention the people. They just say some private people go there and take it.
So what's the archaeological evidence for the plundering? What was actually being removed and what was done with it afterwards?
So my point of departure, or my main basis of archaeological material, I started with researching in Ostia, also in the imperial time, and late antique Ostia is probably the best point of departure to look at the phenomenon of tomb plundering and especially the reuse of tomb material, because Ostia is a city that blossomed in late antiquity in the 4th and 5th century, And for this late antique blooming phase, a lot of all the buildings were destroyed, dismantled, and reused. And Ostia had a very rich high imperial necropolis, so beautiful tombs with a lot of marble ornaments. And these earlier pagan tombs fell out of use. There were new burial sites in the 4th and 5th century, more to the Christian basilicas. And these early tombs at the necropolis were neglected, so they fell victim to plundering. And in Ostia, one looks at the late layers, although they had often been tossed aside, but you can look into the archival reports and you find reused funerary material, for example, tomb inscriptions reused visibly for floors, or you find sarcophagi transformed into a late antique fountain. And you can really also in the baths buildings, in public buildings, you find, for example, in the latrine in Ostia, you find a sarcophagus lid reused as seating for the seating in a latrine. So Ostia is very rich in reuse of funerary material on the one side because it has rich funerary culture in the imperial era, and on the other hand because it has a late antique blooming phase, a strong one.
And is it widespread?
Also other cities from Italy, also in Rome, we can find evidences for reuse of funerary material in late antique houses recently discovered in the city of Rome. If we look, for example, at the Aurelian Wall in Rome, I mean, this is a very good example of late antique funerary reuse because it's built in the late 3rd century, and there is a massive reuse of tomb material within the walls. There are also other cities, like, for example, in Aquileia or Julia Concordia or Ravenna, where we find reused funerary material in late antique public and private buildings. And there are also rural sites, like villas, for example, villas in Latium, where we can find the same habit that funerary materials, so inscriptions, sarcophagi, or sculptures even, were visibly reused to decorate the late antique villas, the floors, or a statue was altered as ornament for the late antique house.
So public buildings and private buildings, are they everywhere?
I also looked, for example, at late antique baths complexes, so baths building throughout Italy, and a lot of them were restored in late antiquity. And for example, near Viterbo, there is a bath complex, an octagonal hall from a bath complex, and within this, a sarcophagus lid had been found, which was transformed into a fountain figure for the bath. So there's a reclining couple on this clean sarcophagus lid, and the hole was inserted into the sarcophagus in order to make a water spout come out of the figure.
So you've got the physical evidence as well as the documentary evidence. And so how did you go about analysing all of that?
So methodology, my main point of departure is that I realized how important it is to consult archival reports hidden in archives of archaeological excavation sites, such as Ostia, for instance, where in the beginning of the 20th century, they excavated, and the excavating, as we all know, in the beginning of the 20th century was throwing away late antique layers. All these late antique layers were tossed aside. But it does not mean what we often think, that these layers are lost. The people who excavated, documented these late antique layers and had written down what they found and what they had seen. So by consulting these lost layers, or my methodology is going back to these layers, so going backward stratigraphy, reading the stratigraphy from the more modern layers downwards and looking medieval late antique layers and looking into the archival reports, I can reconstruct what had been found and find the find context noted within these find reports, and also some notes what the excavators saw, and that they saw that this was installed as a fountain and this was reused in the floor. So they were quite detailed about what they found, although it had been taken away in order to preserve the earlier layers, the imperial layers.
And how did you connect the physical records with the documents?
So I also looked at literary sources of the period where we find frequent commenting on tomb plundering or late antique authors who even witnessed the plundering of tomb and describe this habit, or church fathers who inform us that people reuse tomb material in order to build churches. And by combining this with the legal sources, I get a much better picture or broader picture how frequent this habit was. And then I tried also to look at other sites in the Roman Empire to compare if this habit was not only connected to Italy, but we can also find it in cities of Asia Minor, in Greece, especially also in North Africa, in late antique cities, and also in northern provinces, in Roman Villa, near Trier, for example, we find this habit of reusing tomb material in the 4th and 5th century. I kind of tried to make a post-processional approach, and which allows us not only to know more about the late antique layers, and what kind of values was attributed to earlier elements reused in late antiquity, but also to shed light on questions regarding the survival of the Roman past. Why did some materials survive and why were others destroyed? And this is most important to look at. So looking at late antiquity helps us to understand earlier layers and why they're preserved or why they're not.
So the decoration of late antique buildings shows that this was actually happening frequently and in many different places in spite of the law. How frequent was it?
So concluding from this material evidence I gathered so far from Italy, and I discussed also in the current book I had been writing, I gathered all the materials available from Italy, from the sites, besides from Ostia, also from other late antique sites, and looked at late antique buildings, how frequent this habit had been, and what kind of other material had been reused next to tomb material in order to decorate these late antique buildings. And one can generally observe that the appropriation of tomb decor together with other despoiled building material can be best observed in cities that underwent massive transformations in the 4th and 5th century in Italy. This also counts for beyond Italy. So when we look beyond Italy, also in other cities that underwent transformations in late antiquity, that had imperial cities that were transformed in late antiquity, we can observe that the reuse of tomb decor was very frequent. And looking at this material, I also found out that not only in private building, as the legal sources referred to, material had been reused, but also in public building. That means in public baths, on fora, public squares, and in late antique walls, funerary material had been reused visibly.
So are you saying there's a major organisation behind this?
So what I conclude from this is also that the imperial authority profited from the material available from tomb and went on and despoiled the tomb sites. Or the plundering of tombs, or what I call plundering and robbing, was not something that happened in night by some tomb robbers or a hidden act. It much more looks like that this was a rather official act, or official authority were involved in demolishing and despoiling tombs, and this was a longer process. So one has to think that the panels, the reliefs from tombs had to be despoiled, stored, and then reused for different settings. So this whole process shows to me, or the evidence that I have shows that imperial authority was involved in this business, and that this laws forbidding this habit means maybe that the emperor was more against the private people appropriating this material in order to have this material for his own building projects, for public building projects. For example, a good example to prove this is the Aurelian Wall in Rome, which was built on top of all the earlier tombs around the city. So this was an imperial building project. So all the earlier tombs were destroyed, and the material, although it was forbidden, was reused to build this wall. So we see that to reuse tomb material and to destroy all the tombs was something that had become very frequent since the later 3rd century in the Roman Empire. And this shows a change of practice and also a change of attitudes towards the monuments from the past.
So destruction, violation, robbing, you don't see it like that really, do you?
We have to think about what does this destroying mean? And by reusing tomb material, the monuments were also preserved. So sometimes statues from the tomb were reused in new functions. So it's also a kind of preserving these old monuments and putting them in a different function in a new display. So it's not only destruction, it's also constructing something new with something old. And this is very important. So it's not, we should not only see this destroying or plundering of all the tomb monuments as something negative and something that's only judgmental negatively. We can also see the productive side of these destructions, that while destroying these tombs, new monuments and new decor was created for late antique city spaces.
So where do you go next with this research? There must be much more material to look at.
I currently finished my book, my habilitation work on tomb plundering in Italy and the reuse of funerary material, where I made some statistical approaches, although this is difficult. I collected all literary sources and legal sources where the subject of destruction, appropriation, and transformation play a big role. And I tried to go further by comparing these evidences from other parts of the Roman Empire. So I look also at sites in the northern provinces, but also in Africa and the East. Furthermore, I will try to focus on questions that came up while writing this book, was more about the transformation of city spaces and the transformation of funerary spaces versus city spaces in late antiquity. How did people engage with their memorial past? How can we find out by reusing this material what kind of appropriation and transformation of the material cultures?
I think that leads me really well into my next conversation. So thank you, Cristina. And I'm going to move on to the ongoing relationships between the living and the dead. Joining me now is Dr. Liana Brent of Kenyon College, whose recent work on Roman death and burial has made a priority of integrating various strands of inquiry. Liana, we're going to talk about 2 papers you've published on tomb disturbance. Can you give me a little background to your research?
I was always really interested in Roman death and burial, and I think the way Roman death and burial is conventionally studied, it's often about architecture, art history, and epigraphy. And I was really shocked that the human body didn't play a larger part in that. And so when I went on my first excavation in a Roman cemetery, I was shocked that the human body was really the domain of physical anthropologists, and the tombs and their contents were an entirely separate purview. And so for me, the research questions evolved out of that dissatisfaction and that separation between archaeology and anthropology in the classical world.
Right, so in your TRAC paper, what questions do you ask in order to join up these various forms of investigation?
So in general, my research often addresses the question of what happened to the dead after burial was carried out and completed. And so I'm really interested in reinserting bodies into their tomb contexts and following their transformation from corpse to skeletal remains. And then even a little bit further, when the body sometimes becomes a form of material culture. And so in the TRAC paper, I was looking at one particular case study of a tomb that had been reopened and reused. And I was drawing on the methods of archaeothanatology, which picks up on taphonomy, and it integrates the social practices of the culture who was doing the burying. And I was interested in what we can find out about how the living and the dead interact. And so looking at one particular case study, I was able to trace a number of different phenomena in terms of grave opening, reuse, and why I think that was happening in the Roman world.
So could you tell me about the case study you used to illustrate this?
So in the example that I looked at in the TRAC paper, this was burial number 308 at the Funerary Cemetery in southeast Italy. And right when we opened up the grave, which was a cappuccino structure, meaning that roof tiles were placed in an inverted V shape over the dead. it became pretty clear that there was more than one individual buried within. And we were able, once we removed the top skeleton, it occurred to us that there was a second individual below whose cranium had been lifted up and placed at some point on the pelvis. And so by taking a closer look at how the body decomposes and what kinds of evidence was preserved within the tomb, we were able to reconstruct that the first individual was initially buried inside the grave while their head was still attached at the neck. And after the grave was sealed, after a certain amount of time, the burial was reopened, and the grave diggers, either intentionally or accidentally, dug through the existing grave. And as a result, they picked up the cranium and they moved it, possibly to expiate or to acknowledge the damage or the disturbance to the grave. The head was placed then at the level of the pelvis. And so we were able to determine the sequence of events, the state of the body at the time of the initial form of grave opening, and then subsequent reuse. And this research, what it does, for me at least, is it challenges us to think about grave opening activities as either transgressive behaviors or different forms of disturbance. Because in the process of opening this particular tomb, we found that the body of the initial occupant was fairly disarticulated, or at least the skeletal remains were fairly disarticulated. And so by reconstructing the sequence of events with an aim to understanding the social practices that are behind those events, we were able to trace different relationships that exist through the body and to think about why individuals would have chosen to be buried together in the ancient world.
So we have moved well away from violation or desecration, and you are constructing what you've called an archaeology of disturbance. Could you tell me what you mean by that?
So in terms of an archaeology of disturbance, a lot of the most exciting research that's being done today is taking place in the medieval world, especially in Northern Europe and Scandinavia, where archaeologists are working with different kinds of post-burial rituals. And by thinking through these types of activities as ongoing commemorative rites, it frees us from some of the value-laden terms like damage, disturbance, and reopening or reuse for predatory purposes. And so some of the most exciting work that's being done these days considers different forms of post-depositional activities and why those activities would have been carried out in the first place and what it tells us about the cultural values of different societies. And in the case of the Romans, we have a lot of existing epigraphic, so evidence from inscriptions, as well as juridical evidence that suggests one type of attitude, which is that the Romans were not so keen on grave opening for the purposes of violation. But even violation is a very loaded term and often implies damage to the monument or the memory of an individual, whereas an archaeology of disturbance really foregrounds the body and takes into consideration what happened after burial rites were purportedly carried out and completed, because certainly from my perspective, interactions between the living and the dead were ongoing in the Roman world.
And do you think these grave opening practices are isolated events, or are they a more society-wide phenomenon?
In the course of my doctoral dissertation research, I considered evidence from more than 10,000 Roman tombs to look for patterns in Roman behavior in terms of grave opening, disturbance, reuse, etc. And what I found was that these types of activities are common throughout peninsular Italy, and typically Roman archaeologists focus on major urban centers like Pompeii, Ostia, Rome, etc. And so what my research does is it incorporates cemeteries from the countryside into the discussion, as well as burials that we might consider non-monumental, those for which we're lacking marble structures, inscriptions, etc. And so the project, what began as trying to really think through grave opening practices throughout peninsular Italy, has now in some ways come full circle. And now I'm increasingly interested in how this happens in the imperial capital, what happens at Rome in some of the structures that are more difficult to assess. So my research is moving in the direction of sarcophagi, columbaria, and catacombs for collective burial, because I'm interested not just in how individual case studies of grave opening and reuse occurred, but how people thought about this at the broader societal level in terms of how common grave opening activities were and what we can reconstruct about the rituals that might have been involved in these activities.
Of course, Roman law prohibited the disturbance of tombs, but there is plenty of scope for future research into what people actually did. So how are you going about that?
So in a new paper that's recently been published in the Journal of Roman Archaeology, I explore the practice of grave opening and reuse, not from a legal or an epigraphic perspective, which might see grave opening instances in terms of legal or illegal based on whether or not an individual had the legal right to inclusion in a burial. But I'm interested in what archaeological evidence survives to tell us about the frequency with which this occurred. And so in the case of evidence from Roman cinerary urns for cremation burials, from sarcophagi for inhumation burials, as well as non-monumental burials throughout the Italian peninsula, I'm interested in investigating not just what happened to the existing burial in terms of how the human remains from the first individual were treated, but the reasons why this practice seems to be so common and why archaeologists have typically dismissed this type of behavior as predatory or as a form of unwanted tomb violation.
So are you showing that Roman law was largely ineffective when, archaeologically, people had these desires to reopen the tombs and interact with their dead?
Often cinerary urns or sarcophagi have inscriptions that tell us who was intended to be buried inside. And even though in the majority of cases, the human remains no longer survive in their context for exploration, very often what we find is that the number of human remains or the number of individuals who are interred in a sarcophagus or a cinerary urn does not coincide with what was recorded on the exterior of the receptacle. So this could be for a number of different reasons. In some cases, like with a cremation pyre, there might have been an error in collection, meaning there was residual bones from earlier cremations. And in the case of sarcophagi, they were very often reopened and reused. And so the fact that there isn't always a correspondence between the number of individuals and what was recorded or how many people were intended to be buried within shouldn't surprise us. And I think some of my research is really bringing to light these issues, challenging conventional beliefs about who had the right to burial versus what actually happened over time. Since tombs or burials in general, they're not time capsules that were meant to be sealed in perpetuity, but rather in the Roman world, there was a tendency, whether or not somebody had the legal right to burial, to reopen and reuse these, precisely because the body remained important in death and could be a site of ongoing connectivity.
Thank you so much, Liana Brent. And that was her terrific work on the taphonomy of Roman burials. And you can follow up on all these publications on the website. So that brings us to the end of this episode of Foreign Countries. Join me next time for another conversation.